Let me ask you about Iran vis-a-vis the region. I think a lot of people, including people who are not bought into this caricature of Iran, this cartoon version of Iran about being this apocalyptic cult or whatever, have a lot of people have come to believe, and I might even be one of them, that the events of the last, say, 6 months to a year has actually weakened Iran in terms of its ability to oppose both the United States and Israel and Western powers in general through the Israeli attack, the bombing attack on Iran in retaliation for the missile strikes, which were in retaliation for the bombing of the Iranian consulate in Damascus, that weakened or destroyed Iranian air defenses, including around its nuclear facilities, the forced removal of Bashar al-Assad, who had been an ally of Iran in Syria and has put in power people who are far more sympathetic to the United States and Israel, at least willing to do business with them, and much less so with Iran, as well as the weakening of Hezbollah, the killing of its very charismatic and shrewd leader, has in a lot of ways made Iran a less formidable figure in terms of leading this so-called axis of resistance. Do you think there's validity to that view?
I would disagree, and for a number of reasons. One is that, without a doubt, in war, all sides are weakened. In Ukraine, without a doubt, even though the Russians are winning the war, but the Russians are weakened. They have to spend money, they lose men, they lose equipment, and the Ukrainians, of course, are severely weakened, but so is Europe, so is the United States. The war in Iraq and Afghanistan was like $6, $7, $8, $9 trillion. That's how much money was spent directly or indirectly. And I would assume that in Ukraine, indirectly, forget the direct support, that's just one part of it. The indirect cost of the war in Ukraine will be in many trillions of dollars, the sanctions and so on. But that doesn't mean the weakness comes from one side. I personally think that the biggest loser in this war by far is the Israeli regime, because for many decades, the Israeli regime has promoted itself as a democracy, as representative of the West. And of course, the West, as we were discussing earlier, presents itself as the supporters of human rights and human values and all that is good in this world. But now the regime has destroyed itself. Its image across the world it's in the mud. It's no one sees it as legitimate outside the West, or maybe in some parts of India, but across the global majority or the global South, and even in much of the West, people view it completely in a completely different light than before. They can no longer hide behind the Holocaust in Europe. They can no longer hide behind the word anti-Semitism, regardless of what that exactly means, and the fact that Palestinians are Semites themselves, and more Semite probably than the bulk of the immigrant population that came from Europe and elsewhere to Palestine. So, in my opinion, regardless of the economic hardship that the Israeli regime has imposed upon its own population and the other problems, I think that this was the most important outcome of the war so far. This Holocaust, this genocide is something that the world will not forgive, and this will have a very, very important influence on the way politics play out. With regards to Syria, because I think that the Israelis failed in Lebanon. The fact that they could not take southern Lebanon, regardless of the fact that they martyred Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah and others. The fact that they could not take Gaza either means that they failed. Just today, I think they lost 3 of their soldiers in Gaza. So in the past, when the Israelis would attack Egypt, they'd go all the way to the Suez Canal. But now, after 15 months, they're still stuck in Gaza. In 1982, when they invaded Lebanon, they went all the way to Beirut within days. And now we see that they were unable to make any significant inroads. The only place where one could argue that the Israeli regime achieved a success is in Syria. But there I would also disagree. Many in Iran, ordinary people and across the world, would consider this a victory for coalition between Erdogan, Netanyahu, and Biden. But I personally think that the winner in all this, and again, putting aside the misery that's being imposed upon ordinary Syrians, the fact that the U.S. and Erdogan and Netanyahu imposed Al-Qaeda and its affiliates on the Syrian people, that aside, I think that this worked to Iran's advantage, because the Iranians entered Syria in 2013 after tens of thousands of foreign fighters were brought into the country to bring down the Syrian government. And the only reason why the Iranians entered was because they did not want the black flags of ISIS and Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda over Damascus or Baghdad. And remember, Baghdad was also about to fall, and Lebanon was also in serious trouble. So the Iranians entered in 2013, and so did Hezbollah, to push them back, because the NATO was behind it. Of course, Erdogan was behind ISIS and Al-Qaeda, but so were the countries in the Persian Gulf region. And I think many of them weren't even thinking about the consequences of ISIS in their obsession to defeat Syria because of its relationship with Hezbollah and Iran, that they weren't even thinking about the consequences that it had for themselves. But over the last 3-4 years, Syria has become a burden for Iran. Every year, Iran has been giving them huge amounts of free oil. They've also been funding them. And I think it's maybe, I don't know the real number, but a huge amount of money. Now the Iranians don't have to do that anymore. And this quagmire is going to be something that Mr. Erdogan and Qatar and others are going to have to deal with. The economy in Syria, thanks to this dirty war on the country by NATO and its allies, has reduced the country to 15% of the economy that it had in 2010. And the country is in ruins. The United States is occupying one part of the country. The Israeli regime is moving forward. Even today, they've made further advances in the south. And right now, there's a shortage of fuel. There's a shortage of bread, and the country is in big trouble. And this extremist organization, which is being backed, and right now we see the Western media describing Jolani and his people sort of like the Pahlavis. Like the good guys. You know, this guy was the deputy of ISIS. He was the head of Al-Qaeda in Syria a decade after 9/11, less than a decade after the 7/7 bombings in London, less than a decade, I think, after the Manchester bombing. So you see this person in power. You see him and his group and the groups allied to him, hostile towards all the minorities, the Kurds, and the bulk of the Sunni population as well. It's not as if they support him. And his allies themselves some of them are far more extreme than he is. So how exactly is Mr. Erdogan going to be able to manage these terror organizations remains to be seen. But I think this is the problems that Syria is going to cause for Egypt, for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has distanced itself from this Wahhabi extremism over the past few years. Mohammed bin Salman is moving in a different direction. I don't want to, we can discuss that at another time. But now Erdogan has taken control of these extremist groups. Is that something that Saudi Arabia welcomes? Is that something that Jordan welcomes, or Egypt? This can be a destabilizing factor for the American camp in the region. And so Iran's costs, Iran no longer has the burden of Syria, and those countries that have destroyed Syria through their dirty war, they have to now pay the price. So I'm not quite sure that these people have weakened Iran. I think in the long run, they're going to be the losers, and I don't think Jolani is going to last all that long.
So I definitely get all of that, and I think the United States learned the lesson, although these lessons get learned and then unlearned very quickly when it's time for a new war, that if you go and create instability somewhere or a vacuum of power, very unpredictable results can happen. It was the invasion of Iraq, even according to Tony Blair, the removal of Saddam Hussein, that created the conditions in which ISIS emerged in the Middle East. At least that's what a lot of Westerners, including those who supported the invasion of Iraq, now believe. And so who knows what will emerge out of the mess in Syria, and I absolutely understand the reasons why this has become a huge problem for a lot of actors, including those who promoted it, including Turkey and arguably Israel. But there was Netanyahu not just celebrating the removal of Assad, but essentially taking credit for it, talking about the role that the Israelis played in liberating the Syrian people and all that. So they have clearly made the calculation that this is in their interest, despite the risks and dangers that you're identifying. And I think one of the reasons why it seems almost valid for the Israelis to see it that way is because Syria had been crucial to the Iranians' ability to work with and arm Hezbollah, even to some extent the Palestinians. And with Syria now no longer being a country that's allied with Iran and that Iran can use for that refueling of Hezbollah, the idea, at least from the Israeli perspective and therefore the American perspective, is that one of the losers in all of this is Iran. Why isn't that part true?
Well, there are two parts here that I should point out, two issues. One is that, in my opinion, Netanyahu is working in the interest of Netanyahu and not the Israeli regime. And just like I believe that Erdogan is working in the interest of Erdogan and not in the interest of the people of Turkey or Turkey. Because I believe that this adventure in Syria is not going to do good for the people of Turkey. And I think that the policies over the past 15 months that the Israeli regime has carried out is not going to end well for the regime. If the regime was smart, and again, I apologize for this sort of language, they would have carried out the genocide from October the 8th for a month or two and lied about the beheadings and lied about the rapes, and a lot of the global public opinion would have been with them because Western media has been so powerful. But he went on, and then he should have declared a ceasefire and said, I defeated Hamas, I punished them, and Islamic Jihad, and I won, and he would have had everyone on his side, or a lot of people. But the longer the genocide continued, the more people began to explore the history of Palestine, and they learned about the Nakba, and they learned about what happened to the Palestinian people. And the more they went forward, the more scenes of misery and death and destruction and genocide was being viewed by people across the world, and the Israeli regime became despised across the world. And Netanyahu, he stayed in power, and that I think that's what his objective was and continues to be. But Israel has been destroyed. So if Netanyahu celebrates, and many Israelis would celebrate with him, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good policy for the regime. But what I would say about Syria is that Syria distanced itself from Iran a few years ago. And President Assad, or former President Assad, he began to approach Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. He expelled the bulk of the Iranians who were there to fight against ISIS and Al-Qaeda about 3-4 years ago. And he tilted away. And Hezbollah and Iran had great difficulty in really using the facilities that they once used in Syria over the past few years. And we saw that during this war, these genocidal attacks by Israel on Lebanon. We saw that Hezbollah was unable to use the assets that existed in Syria, and that the Syrian government had tilted away. I'm not saying that they sided with the Israelis or that they worked against Hezbollah, but there is evidence that elements within Syrian intelligence, and I don't know how far it goes up, that they were giving information to the Israeli regime about Iranian or Hezbollah-related assets, and the Israelis were bombing them over the past few years. So while Syria obviously did not have the negative role that Turkey had, I mean, Mr. Erdogan has been selling oil, transporting oil from Baku for the last 15 months, helping to fuel the war machine in Israel to carry out the genocide. Sisi has been doing business as usual. He's also been helping the Israelis use their ports because the Red Sea was closed to the Israeli regime. And Jordan and the Emirates, they've all been helping the regime. He wasn't doing that, but he was definitely not, the Syria under Assad did not have the sort of relationship with Iran over the past 4 years than they did in the past. So I think that increasingly, especially over the last 3 years, the Syrian government has been a burden to Iran. And we have to always remember, it's not that Iran was ever a fan of the Syrian government. It's a Ba'athist regime. And remember, Iran fought against Saddam Hussein, who led another faction of the Ba'athist party. But for Iran, Syria under President Assad, or former President Assad, was infinitely better than ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And that continues to be the belief today, that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are not good for Syria, they're not good for the region, and they're not good for the war. And what has happened in Syria is going to have consequences. And I think even Mr. Erdogan is underestimating the anger that exists in China and Russia and Central Asia when they see these many thousands of extremists armed and trained by Turkish intelligence, fighting in Syria, and also some of them calling for jihad, as they call it, in their own countries. And by the way, just one thing that I would like to add, these extremist groups, as you know, and I'm sure many in your audience know, they were created by the West. And it began in Afghanistan. I don't want to go into history. Their first textbooks that were printed for children to use in Afghanistan were published with USAID money and at the University of Nebraska. So this is not Islam. This is American Islam, or this was Saudi Islam. Again, Saudi Arabia has distanced itself from these people, but this is not an indigenous Islam to this region. This is a group. These are groups that the United States and its allies created, and they've destroyed so much of our region. And another thing is that it's these groups that the West created, and that the Israelis have also been supporting, that together have destroyed so much of our region and led to millions of people to flee to Europe. So those people in Europe who are so angry about immigration, they should look to people like Netanyahu, and they should look to people in Washington and European capitals that have been funding these extremists that have ultimately together led to so many people leaving the region. Otherwise, I think many of the people who are living in Europe would have preferred to stay at home, but when your homes are destroyed, you have to go somewhere safe.
Yeah, it's amazing always when I see Americans seeing for the first time American media accounts from the 1980s talking about Osama bin Laden with headlines like anti-communist warrior or anti-Soviet fighter is heralded as the future of Afghanistan, and people become very confused at how this satanic figure was once celebrated in Washington, similar to the way that Jelani was once talked about, the way Osama bin Laden now is, and has had a kind of reverse conversion. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.